man.
Yeah, I see it. I see it.
You know.
Hello.
Those boys both rock and roll.
Oh dear.
I think there's some fellas to watch.
Wonderful. Yes, 14. Thank you so much. Welcome,
I love
welcome.
the T diagram.
Isn't the T amazing, Emma?
Yeah.
That's genius.
I like it because I'm a little teapot.
Short and stout. Okay. Here we go. Welcome everyone. No sleep. Big X right through it. Love the party hats. Those are
Is
good.
that what that is? I thought it was a sundae. I thought somebody was making like blueberry ice cream.
Amazing. With a cherry on top.
And
It's
sprinkles.
perfect. It's so good. Okay.
Stinky.
Wonderful. Switch off the news. Not many of you are switching off the news. I hear you. I can't switch off the news. So that's totally fine. Get outside. Be active. Good. Read something escapist. What are you reading?
Put it in the chat.
And Smith, if you were going to pick one book, that you're going to pick my book. So I'm going to say it first.
I think I taught you about the book.
Yeah, I think you did.
You're gonna say.
No. So something escapist for me, an amazing book that has just been released as a mini series type short series thing. Is Station 11. For me, that was like so good. I couldn't I couldn't put it down. And then when it was over, I grieved. Like I wanted it to continue. The Sixth Extinction, thank you. I'll read that. Is amazing. Super good. I have made a promise to myself to read more. When I was a kid, I used to read, like, that's all I ever did. Even at, like, social events, I would go to the bathroom and I would sit there and read a book in one of the stalls.
Discworld, Song of Achilles, The Goldfinch.
There we go. Goldfinch, yeah, that's another one.
Verity.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Let's copy and paste these and put them somewhere.
Yeah. Well, that's why we use this chat.
Yeah.
There it is.
Because there it is.
Maintained forever.
Wonderful. Same. I was such a loser. No. We don't say loser. We say intellectual. Yeah.
Geronimo Stilton.
Wonderful. So good. Thank you. That's great. I think
Loveless.
Geronimo Stilton is that mouse, right? Is it a mouse? It's a mouse, right? I don't remember. Okay. The Silent Patient. Brilliant. Good.
The most recent book that I'm reading is with our children, and it's one of the adventures of Jack and Annie.
Amazing. Speaking of our children, they are home today, so we may have some interruptions. I hope you don't mind, like this one that's happening right now, so it'll be fine. Right. Famous last words. Okay. The Maidens. Amazing. Thank you. Wonderful. Not a loser. Very good. Super. Okay. That's great. Anything else? No. Oh my goodness. The shark. That's awesome. I love it. No. The poor sheep or the yak or the cow or the something. That's brilliant. We have to screenshot that because we can't let it, we can't let that go. Check out the shark.
Is that,
No.
Papa Shark?
Okay. Save. Amazing. Thank you. Great. Welcome, everyone. Oh, folks still coming in? Good. Okay.
My mind's a blank.
Your mind is a blank
Yeah.
of good books?
Just
Escapist
a blank.
books? A blank.
My mind is a
A
blank.
mouse. Stilton. Geronimo Stilton is a mouse. Okay.
The most recent thing that I read was the chapter that I didn't finish writing over the weekend.
Yeah.
And it sucks. It's my least favorite chapter of a book ever.
Yeah. That's okay. Okay. There we go. Really good. Okay. I'm going to clear this. I don't want to, again, but we have a copy of it. And another one. Okay. Clear all drawings.
Here we go.
Yeah. Okay. On to serious things. You're still coming in, though. Welcome. Welcome, everyone, joining us. We're going to do some stuff today. Here's the list of stuff we're going to do. And maybe some more. One of the things, though, as we transition now into physiology, we always like to kind of reflect a little bit on what we've done so far, what we've learned. how it can be sort of integrated into some of our experiences as humans, and why some of those types of things might be really important. And so that's what we're going to do right now. And then halfway through, we'll kind of launch into physiology as the last area topic of this course. So yay, that's kind of a milestone, right?
It is kind of crazy.
We can celebrate it. Okay. So let's talk a bit about humans. And we are not going to do it justice. We are not going to talk about it nearly enough. What we wanted to do, though, was to kind of introduce the idea of thinking about some of the concepts that we've been learning in the context of the human species, recognizing, of course, how complex human history and culture and language and biology are, and how different the species human is, even compared to other ones. We talked a little bit, for example, about cod and the different niches that they occupy in different stages of their life cycle, which is not terribly unique. It's cool, but it's not terribly unique. And if we want to kind of talk a little bit about how humans are indeed different, one of the things that is quite unique, maybe not only to humans, but definitely rare, is the idea that a species can occupy multiple niches within that life stage. So if you think about human adults and you think about them across the world, I'm pretty sure that you can recognize that they would occupy different niches depending upon where they are. And that's kind of a unique thing. And so, if we want to simplify it, like super simple, right? Some humans, some big populations of humans are entirely herbivores. Some of them are almost entirely carnivores. And that's really simplified. So there are some that feed entirely on marine systems. They're pescivores, or, it's just an incredible amount of diversity that exists within our species. And so that's why we have entire colleges that are dedicated to different aspects of humanity, that study psychology, that study family nutrition, that study all sorts of things related to human health. And we have one department of biology that does the rest for all of the other species. And so I think it's a real celebration. And Smith would like an entire college dedicated to the invertebrates. And I don't think I would disagree, because I think across all of those species, there is quite a bit of diversity. But certainly even the way that academia is organized recognizes that the distinct kind of complexity of humanity, which I think is interesting.
I think it's interesting too.
Okay, so here is a distribution map of humans. So we can kind of take a look at it. It's a hypothesis, right? And so every year, or maybe not every year, but it's certainly every decade, we kind of rejig those little pathways, and we change the dates on things in beautiful and interesting ways, right? There's no one way that humans occupied a certain territory or colonized a certain territory. There's no one story. And again, I think it makes total sense that there would be diversity in the way that humans moved around the planet. But here is one kind of hypothesis that shows the distribution of humans. They call it a migration. It's not, though. Migration is more about coming and going. This is really sort of a range expansion, right, that we were talking about from ecology. And so it's interesting even just to look at the years and all of that stuff and to think about it. Let's see if we can apply some of the evolutionary principles that we have been talking about pretty much since the beginning. I'm going to ask you a loaded question. So where on the planet, if we're thinking about the planet, say, as it was up to 500 years ago, where on the planet would you expect to find the most genetic diversity within the human species?
Are we going to annotate?
Yes, please. Go ahead and stamp. Or no, you can chat. You can do whatever you want, but stamping would be cool.
There are some hypotheses.
There are some hypotheses.
Yeah.
Super good. Okay. Okay, and where on the planet, so most of you are stamping in the color red, so let's pick another color. Let's go with green check marks, because they'll probably show up. Where on the planet with the green check mark would you expect within the human species, up to about 500 years ago, there to be the least amount of genetic diversity within the genome? Interesting. Okay, cool. Cool. Okay. So imagine that we're going to try to apply some of these concepts directly to what we're talking about here in the evolutionary concepts. Which ones are we kind of dancing around? Which kind of evolutionary mechanisms are kind of at play here? Gene flow, sure. What else?
Founder effect.
Founder effect, question mark. Brampton has a lot of diversity. Really? Okay, cool. Yeah, migration is a thing. Immigrate, yeah, super good. Super good. These are good words. Okay. So when we're talking about sort of a decrease in genetic diversity as a result of migration or as a result of range expansion, we're really talking about the founder effect, remember? Because it happens over generations. It's not like somebody just starts walking out of Africa and like ends up somewhere like South America in one generation, right? That would be gene flow. Gene flow really plays into it within the last 500 years, where there's a lot of immigration and emigration going back and forth across these different continents, right? And lots of, mixing of populations, right? So it's really about founder effect. And if you take a look at the genetic profiles of folks that are living in Africa compared to those living in South America, you really do see a difference in that very small proportion of variation that we actually have across individuals, right? And it's not like a bad thing or a good thing, it's a thing, right? Except for, sort of more variation can lead to overall more resilience, but maybe not. So it's really just more of a kind of intellectual exercise, right? And it's kind of cool to think about it. And so actually what I want to do is kind of shift all of your check marks in Australia and put them on South America. Because that's where I want to go. And in fact, thanks, you're doing it. Awesome. Okay. So, in fact, if we take a look at the genetics of people, that occupied that area that many years ago, we do see this decrease in slight and statistical, decrease in genetic variation. And that's because those peoples that came or that migrated or moved into South America were then being subsections of populations, right? They were kind of a population would establish itself, and then some folks would move further south, and then some folks from that would, over these generations and generations. And so it's this subsampling that reduces the variation pool, right? From the exact same principle as the founder effect. Is that good? And if we take a look at all sorts of, the effects of that mass migration or that mass range expansion, we can see it not only in our DNA, but in other aspects. For example, in our culture. We can see it in the diversity of languages, for example. So this is looking at the number of languages that are present, right, within the different regions around the world. And we can see the very dark green areas have more linguistic diversity than some of the other ones in a very similar way, you know, that follows along that very same type of migratory pattern, which is kind of cool, right? So most of the linguistic diversity that we have is represented within the different countries of Africa, as well as India. New Guinea also has quite a diversity of languages. And then we can take a look at indigenous languages and see even more so a very, very strong pattern. Okay, good. How many languages are there in the world? I think documented about 5,000, and I think we're losing thousands of them. Yeah. Okay, and kind of even cooler than this, because this is like number of languages, we can look at the diversity of these kind of, they're called bits, sort of individual bytes. Think about them maybe even as like a syllable, like the diversity of syllables within a language, the number of different types of sounds that you can make, and the sort of the variation that you would need in order to be able to communicate an idea that is different than another idea. Okay, so let's just call those bits. And we can look at the number of bits within languages around the world, and still it holds, which is amazing. Okay, so the complexity of languages, or the diversity, the bit diversity within languages is greatest in Africa, as well as along the early migration route, right? And then slowly, kind of as a result of like the same type of founder effect principles, then the number of bits starts to drop off within the individual languages, right? And these would be within the indigenous languages, largely represented. So that when you get to Hawaii, for example, which is right here, you get very sort of simple to the point of needing to repeat the same syllable to double the information, right? So you see a lot of repeated sounds, sometimes twice, sometimes up to 3 times, and then those repeats carry, or the frequency of repeats carry different information because they have fewer bits. I love this stuff. I hope you do too. I think it's fascinating. And we can also look at our relationship with invertebrates.
Yeah, and this is an interesting thing because we tend to think of ourselves as a special species. And certainly, even if we don't think of ourselves deliberately as special, we certainly think of ourselves, I think, most of the time as being a singular species, not one that's hosting a whole bunch of things. But in fact, we host multitudes, lots and lots of different diversity, internally and externally. And some of them, this is a facial mite that for certain is living in all of your pores, in and around your nose, and more than likely you inherited those from your mom. And more than likely, if it wasn't your mom, it was certainly your dad. There's intimate, these mites are passed on during kind of intimate childcare. And then you get more and more of them as you go through your life. And one of the amazing things about the diversity of these mites is that their intraspecific variation, their intraspecific phylogeny, like populations to populations, maps almost exactly onto different places in the world, different geographic centers of origin for people. So there's an enormous diversity of mite lineages in and around Africa, in and around Asia. All of those dense colors that we saw in the last bit of migration mapping, which you highlighted in terms of where's some of the most, where's some of the least, that's also, those are hotspots for so within species, intraspecific mite diversity as well. And these are mites that we're carrying around and that we have done this to as we have migrated. They have migrated.
there's nothing quite like seeing one of your face mites on a slide moving around. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah. And if you're interested in participating in the face mite study,
take 2700 and we will sample your face mites and sequence them and add to our understanding of their diversity around the world.
that's right. You can DNA barcode your mites in 2700 with Smith in a second year course. It's great. Okay, cool. So all sorts of really interesting ways of studying humans, including the face mites. And one place in particular that I'd like to take you to kind of outline some of the story is right to the southern tip of South America. And one of the reasons why I want to take you there is because it's fascinating. I also used to live there. And so I was able to learn a little bit about the history of the land called Tierra del Fuego. Tierra del Fuego means the land of fire. And it refers to this southern region here. This is the island of Tierra del Fuego, and it's mostly, well, there's quite a bit of it in Argentina. It's also on the Chilean side as well. And it's called Tierra del Fuego because when colonizers were sailing down the Beagle Channel right here and the Magellan Strait, these are colonizers obviously from Europe, they saw these huge bonfires all in the forests, all in the trees on the shores that they were sailing by. And of course, those were all of the indigenous people that were living there for a very long time. Not as long as in other places, because remember, they were the last to colonize or to migrate down into these areas. So when the colonizers came, they obviously interacted with the indigenous people that were there, and they called the land of fire after their observation of the bonfires that were on the along the shoreline. And so here you can see, so these are the Malvinas Islands, and
unless you grew up in the UK.
Unless you grew up in the UK, you would call them something differently, but I do not. We call these the Malvinas, and here is South Georgia Island, which is just absolutely spectacular, and then here is the northern tip of Antarctica, and the South Shetland Islands are here.
The balmy.
Yeah. So I used to live here because it was easy to jump onto ships that were sailing here. So I spent a lot of time crossing the Drake Passage. I'm not sure how many times, probably around 100. It was miserable every time because these are the biggest waters in the world because all of the Southern Ocean funnels into this kind of very narrow passage that takes about 2 days, 50 hours or so to sail if you're not hit in a storm. So let's just kind of zoom in a little bit. This is a town here called Ushuaia. And right across over here is the most southern town, even though Ushuaia will tell you it is the most southern town. It is not. It is Puerto Williams in Chile, and that's just over here. So these are the two communities. Ushuaia has a very kind of like Whistler vibe. It's full of young folks that are into ecotourism, and these mountains here are the only mountains within the Canadian summer that have snow to be able to practice. So the Canadian ski team does spend time in Ushuaia practicing on the slopes there.
And when they're filming Leonardo DiCaprio eats a bear or gets eaten by a bear movies and they run out of snow in Alberta.
That's right.
This is where
they go.
This is where they move to. So if you notice, like, the trees look a little bit different in the background now, it's because they went south to follow the snow.
Exactly. Okay. Anyway, if you're into like cabin in the woods, off grid, kind of, living in basically Narnia, this is where you want to go. Okay. So zooming in even more. So this is what Ushuaia looks like, more or less, with the glaciers up here.
What was your house?
It's really stunning. Oh, my house was like, so where at Ushuaia. So this is what you're seeing right now is this part, and mine was in Valle Andorra, which is right here. It was like right up here, off grid. We had a hole for water we called Olaf, and yeah. Beautiful little cabin, but yeah, not super easy. Okay.
How long were the planks with which you build your house?
Oh, yeah, so yeah, we had to like sneak them in our Jimny, Suzuki Jimny, in order to be able to like.
Which is a four-wheel drive vehicle that's about this long.
It's the smallest four-wheel drive vehicle that you can buy.
It's like driving popcorn.
That's right. And in order to be able to do any repairs to the house, we had to like sneak materials through this gate in our Jimny. So everything had to be no more than 4 feet long. Anyway, it's a long story. Okay. So here's Ushuaia, and these mountain ranges, these are the end of the Andes, because the next part of the Andes picks up in Antarctica. So this is the South American continental end of the Andes, but the mountain range does continue underwater and emerges then up in Antarctica. Okay.
Like Godzilla.
Right. And before colonizers came, there were people, like a lot of people. And this was a rich and beautiful and totally sustainable environment for all sorts of people as well as wildlife.
Huge number of productive niches, terrestrially and
Yeah,
aquatically,
yeah.
and marine.
It's quite a remarkable ecosystem, or series of ecosystems. And so the two dominant indigenous groups in this area were the Jamana, which are featured on the bottom left, and the Selknam, which are featured on the top right. And the reason why they're there is because the Selknam occupied the plains that were this larger part of Tierra del Fuego on the other side of the Andes range. So here's the Andes range. And the Jamana, they lived on the coastlines right within the Andes mountains. Now, if you remember, their history was, their migration was that they were some of the last people to inhabit previously uninhabited by human land, right? So they arrived relatively recently, right, compared to some other populations of people. They were genetically very, very similar as a result, right? Because if you could imagine, then perhaps the Jamana were this founder effect subpopulation of the Selknam, who were just living slightly north, right? It could be another group, but all of the groups within sort of Patagonia would be genetically very, very similar. But they were very, very different. Of course, we're all different from each other. These people were very, very different from each other in terms of their niche, in terms of the way that they interacted with the environment. So the Jamana were marine for the most part. They fed off of marine environments and marine systems. They ate sea lions, or they hunted sea lions. They used whale materials from whales that would beach. They didn't actively hunt them from what we know, but they certainly used all of the materials that were available to them when whales were beached, or dolphins and things like this. They also harvested freshwater mussels and saltwater mussels and all sorts of seafood. And they didn't have a culture that included things like clothing. They spent a lot of time in the water. Probably the idea is that, dealing with wet clothing all the time would probably introduce all sorts of other health concerns. And so they made huge bonfires in order to be able to keep warm when they were out of the water. So they spent a lot of time in the water. The Selknam, however, did have a culture of wearing clothing because, well, one of the reasons too was they had a source. The Jamana didn't really have much of a source, except for they probably could have used fur seal pelts. But the Selknam were very, very terrestrial, and they were hunters of an animal called the guanaco. And the guanaco is very much like a llama. It was the largest animal that was available within the ecosystem of Patagonia before, of course, colonizers brought sheep. And so you can see them here in the photo wearing as clothing the pelts of the guanaco, which they hunted. They used bows and arrows. The Jamana used more like spears in order to be able to get their food. Genetically, almost indiscernible. but very, very different in terms of their relationships with the environment. The Selknam were called Lasonas by the Jamana. Lasonas means the others, and that's not a unique thing where you have sort of groups of folks that are living, side by side. The name that they have for the other one is often the others, as a means of kind of keeping some cultural separation. So the history of the Jamana and the Selknam is not good. It is not unique in the way that it ended. The Selknam, the last person that is identified as being of Selknam descendants, died in well, there are two records. One of them, though, the most optimistic one, was 1974. And they were deliberately targeted for, in genocidal acts by colonizers. The Jamana also destroyed as a result of colonization. And this is Cristina Calderon. She lived in Puerto Williams, so in actually the most southern town in South America. And she was considered to be a knowledge as well as language holder for the Jamana people. The language is called Jagan, and she grew up learning it as a first language. And there are very few people these days who hold that type of knowledge for many, many indigenous cultures around the world. Cristina Calderon was very active in her community in making sure that her knowledge was passed on. This is the first year that I am introducing her as someone who has passed away. So she passed away this year, and it was a bit of a shock. I always check every year before this class because I've been introducing Cristina Calderon and the Jamana and the Selknam to students since 2012, mostly in another class that I teach or used to teach on humans in the natural world. This year, though, I was a little bit shocked. Died not that long ago at a fantastic age, 93. May we all make it to 93. Because she was so active and so generous with her knowledge, she left behind quite a bit of wealth that I think is important. Most importantly, her daughter and her granddaughter, who are certainly very invested in making sure that the stories of the Jamana are not lost. And Cristina wrote a book called I Want to Tell You a Story that is available on Amazon if you're at all interested. There are some students that take anthropology classes, for example, and there's an assignment that you have to write, I think, about a group of people. And I know that students have been writing about the Jamana and the Selknam, and I think, I hope anyway, that it is of value. And if any of this is of interest to you, I have a feeling that humans are an interesting species to a lot of you. If any of this is interesting, so certainly Christina's book is one to get. All of the links are going to be clickable on the slides when we post them. But also a pretty good summary, a good place to start. I wouldn't end here. But a good place to start if you'd like a bit of a summary of like the whole history of human distribution or migration with quite a focus on colonization and the effects that colonization has had on the world. Guns, Germs, and Steel, it's a classic. It's getting old. And it's still a good place to start if you're at all interested. Yeah, we're all getting old. Yeah.
It's kind of a neat way, talking about the humans being a different species. This is a neat way where, for many species, latitude is a segregating factor.
Yeah.
And one of the major theses of Diamond's book is longitude.
Yeah.
And the importance of longitude. And that's that's a neat tweak on potentially maybe not unique, but close to.
Yep.
For our species.
Yep. super nice. One of the things, just to kind of tie it in too, was, the reason for, why folks from one side of the world colonized another side of the world and not the other way around, and all of these things. And there are some very interesting environmental differences, right? In terms of the way that the planet is set up and the different resources that were available, with the Wanako, for example, being the largest terrestrial animal that was virtually undomesticatable. Like they're just mean. These llamas are mean. You can't domesticate a llama. And if that's your only available resource, then it certainly does change the way that your technology develops, right? Whereas if you have access to cows and horses and things like this, you have different access to different sort of natural resources. And anyway, it's a really interesting kind of beginning. Don't end there. Okay. So we are going to briefly introduce physiology, because physiology is kind of what comes next in all of this discussion, right? So we've kind of figured out how things get where they are. We kind of figure out like how they end up evolving and all of this stuff. And now we're really going to be diving into what individuals experience, right? And that really is about their physiology. So we're going to go into topic number 3 in a very similar way that we've been doing it. There's no difference. It all kind of flows, hopefully, now that you've got the kind of flow of the way that the course is built.
But I hope that as we do it, you see and enjoy the fact that we're not leaving ecology and evolution behind, that the best way to enjoy the study of physiology is perhaps how it wasn't taught historically. Certainly not when I took it like a million years ago, when it was a very individualistic, separate, this is how the species works, you must learn and memorize these things. And the truth is, because of the diversity of life fostered by evolution through time, and the number of niches and the diversification of contemporary life, there's an enormous set of physiological norms that are outside of the norm of the classic model species. And we need people like you to understand and to come back and teach this course and to teach us about those things. There's a big review about thermal tolerance, which is associated with climate change, which is a thing that we need to know a lot about. And their conclusions based on most of the diversity of life, invertebrates, were based 60% on individual species of ants. Why do people study ants? Because ants are easy to catch. And that's it. And so there's so much that we don't know yet with physiology, that by combining these 3 things, we're going to go that much farther. And we kind of have to, because we've created, or our generations before us and us have created a situation where we need to know these things. We have an obligation to understand these things, because we're changing the playing field faster than the mechanisms that we talked about, evolutionary or ecological, can keep up.
Wonderful. So what is physiology? I don't know. I have a PhD in physiology. I'm not really sure. It's just all the stuff that happens inside a body instead of like outside. Is that okay?
I think it's pretty good.
Yeah.
My master's is in physiology.
You did a physiology master's? Yeah. Okay, good. So yeah, it's like all the things that happen inside your body, all the functions, right? Of organ systems, not so much of the organism, but like everything inside. Everything outside is like ecology and interactions and those types of things, right?
But think back to mechanisms that we talked about both in evolution and particularly in ecology in terms of the influence of abiotic or biotic factors. Those have clear, those are coming along with us as we talk about physiology, about how you're affected by abiotic conditions like temperature, or biotic conditions like, it's that time of the year when we're thinking of love.
Not yet. That's the spring.
Yeah, and it's not the spring yet.
No.
It is the winter.
Cool. Okay, so let's just remind ourselves super quickly, where on the planet would you anticipate the greatest average temperature change as a result of the climate crisis? Good. Super. And just rethinking about that game that New Zealand likes to play to find maps that do not include them. There we go. Thank you, Ava. And thank you to everyone who also noticed that Antarctica is not represented on this map. So yes, certainly in the Arctic, we would anticipate seeing average temperature change first. And I'll tell you why. It's kind of super cool. We're just running out of time today, but I will tell you why at some point, but also in Antarctica, but maybe not so much within the actual continent. Certainly on the peninsula, as it goes up towards Argentina and Chile, we would see a lot of changes, very similar to what we see in the Arctic, but I'll tell you why later, I promise, because it is kind of cool. Okay.
Where?
Yeah. So lots of reasons to be concerned about this, right? And lots and lots of human reasons to be concerned about this. Clearly, there's all sorts of things going on in the world with respect to the climate crisis that I think, to be perfectly honest, I kind of feel need to be prioritized a lot more than they are. Scientifically, I think we've made the case that the climate is changing, and I think now it is time to dive into more of the political and social action that's necessary in order to actually support people, support adaptation, and if at all possible, support mitigation. But there are things that we can learn still, and this course will acknowledge way more maybe than some of you want, that there are cultural, political, economic effects, aesthetic effects, other effects that are really important, but we will be focusing primarily on the biological ones because it's also really important to understand how it affects living systems, because if we don't understand how it works, then it's very difficult to take any action to protect it. So, big yellow box around the biological effects. Yeah, so these are just kind of things that we're going to be touching on within the reading material, key biotic variables, examples of some plants and some animals. There's some pretty cool stuff coming, how temperatures change how temperature changes will affect the organisms and different levels of organization. You'll get a lot of that from the course link pre-readings. And then, of course, in a very similar way, we'll kind of try to wrap it up and do things together in the actual classes. So we spent quite a bit of time in biospheres or biomes, ecosystems, communities, populations in the first part of this course, right? And now we're going to be kind of diving into, diving into organisms, organ systems, and we're going to go like pretty far down, at least to molecular examples of some of the things related to adaptations to the cold.
How will climate change affect protons?
Oh, just wait. It's fascinating. It's really cool, and I hope you enjoy it. And so we're going to be kind of, playing around here in all of the complexity of our own bodies as well as the bodies of other pretty amazing animals.
So this is a thing, as Dr. Jacob said, this is a thing that we've been talking about for a while as scientists, and there's a not complete consensus. There is never complete consensus. But there's some amazing kind of review papers that are now in big journals. This is from Science, which is, the second largest journal in the world, where a lot of authors got together and talked about, at the close of what was then the 4th International Polar Year, to look at making a call in the literature to say, these are some things that we know we are seeing across borders, but across polar landscapes, changes associated with the climate crisis. So what were they talking about? Well, for one, they were talking about the change in phenology, the change in timing of things. So what you're looking at there are these little sticks, these like pickup sticks slanted over. So we've got colored lines from 1995, which you're like, oh my God, that's so long. And I'm like, that's earlier, like this afternoon. But from 1995 to 2010, just before the paper was published, looking at the date, the timing of the year on the y-axis, where all of these major trees or shrubs were flowering in the north. And you can see almost unambiguously, they're all flowering earlier. And you can imagine this has enormous consequences, particularly to the things that eat them, but also to those shrubs themselves if they're dependent upon other taxa for pollination. One of the other big changes is in terms of, speaking of herbivores, thinking about the effect of a changing climate on large mammals, like in this case, caribou, and looking at population sizes that are responding positively, perhaps to an increasing temperature, but that are also experiencing reductions in fecundity and an increase in starvation. So a redistribution of, remember those, like the births minus deaths, immigration minus, so those key elemental ecological kind of variables are being affected by the ground and upon the air within which they're living. We're looking at changes, shifts. We've talked about range shifts before, but we're seeing range shifts in plants and their herbivores where there were never shrubs before. Then they are kind of leaking out onto the landscape and changing what's growing where and when. And then we're seeing the arrival and replacement of different things. So Arctic species like the fox that are being replaced in some near Arctic or subarctic locations with their boreal and southern relatives, the red fox. So all of these changes across multiple, so here we've got from plants to herbivores, so from plants to herbivores to predators, populations, and unambiguously we know these things are changing. And these have big effects. So this is kind of another big paper from a big, if you're writing a paper about a topic and you find any kind of an indication, if it's in Google Scholar, for instance, to say there's a journal that's called the Annual Review of blah, blah, blah. The annual review series are an amazing place for you to kind of kickstart your research because they are compendia of things we know at that point. And Camille Parmesan, who is the author of this other one, when I wanted to point her out, because one of the things about the last author list is that it's a little bit white male, and she is not one of those things. And this is a great article and a great kind of compendium of a lot of these things. And this is the abstract, and I like it for a couple of reasons, because it talks about calls to action, things that we need to know, and it talks about potential groups where we are going to see the largest changes. Range restricted species, particularly polar, but also mountaintop, and that then stretches where you're going to put those dots on the map to include mountains all across latitude, where there's going to be range contractions and where polar and high mountaintop species are going to or have gone extinct already.
Yeah.
And how are we going to think about this? Through the lens of put on your polar bear glasses.
So we are going to talk quite a bit about polar bears, not only about polar bears.
Yeah, but it's a great, why wouldn't we?
They're amazing.
Yeah.
Yes. And so we'll kind of think about it in the context of the polar bear for the next little while. We will hopefully by the end of this topic be able to discuss enough tools and enough ideas with you so that you can walk through a bit of an argument related to figuring out what will really happen to polar bears. And hopefully you'll enjoy all of that, as well as the introduction of some of the other maybe less charismatic but equally as awesome species that we're going to be introducing to you. So the next time we see you, which is not super far away from now, so I'm glad, we will launch into thinking about some polar bears and some of the information we will introduce to you about their natural history, and we'll start to kind of figure out what might happen to them as a result.
Take care of each other. Take care of yourselves.
Bye.
Remember from that click at the start, do some mental care.
Yep.
Turn off the news. For a little bit.
For a little while. Okay. Bye. So the delivery of the drugs came?